of VITA sites on the California foster youth tax credit and assisting clientele who are current and former foster youth. I am going to go to our introduction here. And first, I'll just talk a little bit about who John Burton Advocates for Youth is. So John Burton Advocates for Youth, or JBAY as we go by, is a nonprofit organization that improves the quality of life for youth in California who have been in foster care or homeless by advocating for better laws, training communities to strengthen local practices, and conducting research to inform policy solutions. Since 2017, we've conducted the California Foster Youth Tax Project, which at this point includes a series of strategies to promote utilization of the California Foster Youth Tax Credit and other tax credits that youth are commonly eligible for. It was initially started as an effort to promote utilization of the Cali ITC when those policies shifted that increased access to transition age youth that didn't have dependents. And really that segued into advocating for the establishment of the foster youth tax credit. This project is a collaboration between county child welfare agencies, nonprofit service providers, youth-led organizations, some which have actually set up VITA sites specific to foster youth, and state agencies, really all to inform foster youth about the benefits of tax filing and to help them successfully file. So again, I'm Simone Turek-Lee. I'm the Director of Housing and Economic Mobility at John Burton Advocates for Youth, and I'm thrilled to introduce Carla Macias. Carla is a consultant. She was previously with the County of Santa Clara for many years and worked on a range of issues related to young people in foster care or that are formerly in foster care, and is now consulting and is our key consultant on this project. Her consulting agency is called Foster Advantage Consulting, and she is a VITA trained consultant. So she is our VITA expert and has been partnering with us from the beginning and was actually with Santa Clara County when we piloted this project in that county. So she's been with us from the beginning and knows her stuff really well. Thanks so much to everyone who's on. Thanks for taking today's training. And we're thrilled to have you here. The foster youth tax credit's a really important tool to help youth who are currently or formerly in foster care increase their annual income, but also it's a great incentive for them to learn how to handle tax filing, which is an important but often overlooked independent living skill. Something that we all someday have to do, even if we don't have to do it when we're young, it's something we will someday have to do. So it's a great skill to teach young people as they're transitioning to adulthood. So with that, I'm going to just share a little bit about what we'll be talking about today. And I also want to say, we will be using the questions box in Zoom. So if you have questions, please do enter them, or you feel free to enter them into the chat as well. And we'll do a Q&A session at the end of the training. If there are clarifying questions that come up throughout the training, we'll kind of handle those as they come, but we'll definitely leave some time for questions at the end as well. So first, we'll provide an overview of foster care and of foster youth, because I know not everyone on the call is familiar with the foster care system or kind of how that works. We won't go into the weeds, but we'll just provide a quick overview to make sure we're all sort of on the same page. We'll provide an overview of the California Foster Youth Tax Credit, or the FYTC, and then we'll talk about how to claim the FYTC in TaxSlayer. And then we'll cover some special topics related to the FYTC and foster youth. And lastly, we'll talk about helping youth receive their refund, and really that agenda item should probably be broader than that. It's really kind of the aftermath, or kind of what comes at the end, addressing identity theft, helping youth receive their refund, making sure that young people have the information they need moving forward. So without further ado, let's jump in. What we want to do first, and we'll do this now, and we'll do this at the very end of the training, is just get a feel for where you are. I know some of you might already be familiar with the California Foster Youth Tax Credit. Some of you may just be hearing about it today. So we want to kind of get an idea of where people land. So I'm going to launch a poll. If I can be technologically savvy enough to do that. And I'm going to, here we go. And I'm going to ask that you respond to the poll based on where you are. 0 being, I don't feel prepared yet, need more information, and 10 being, I'm good to go. I have all the information I need and I feel prepared. I'm just on this training to support my peers, maybe. And it looks like we've got a real range of responses, which is great. We've got some 0s, we've got some 10s, and then everything in between. So I'll give it another couple seconds and then I will end the poll. And while people are completing that, I know someone is asking about the recording. Yes, absolutely. I should have mentioned that. We are recording this webinar. We will send everyone who registered the recording as well as a copy of the slides. And we also are considering doing another training in January in case folks missed it and want to be in a live training versus viewing the recording. So, but we'll definitely at a minimum send the recording to everyone. And feel free to share it far and wide. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results here. Yeah, so we've got about 36% are not there yet, right at that 0. And then we've got all the way at 10, we've got 8%. And then we've got a bunch of in-betweens. It looks like there are, I would say, a very even share of people across these range of the range of numbers. So that's fantastic. I'm gonna exit the poll now. All right, and Carla, I'm gonna ask you to just, do you see the PowerPoint slides still?
Yes, I do.
Fantastic. I'm always worried with the polls that we lose our screen share. Okay. So section 1, again, this is an overview section. We'll talk about the foster care system generally. We'll talk about the experiences of young people who have been in foster care, kind of generically. We know everyone has a different experience, but some of the common things that you could expect. And then some guidance about how to work with young people who have been in foster care, given their trauma history, given that they're probably first-time filers, most likely, and just provides kind of a foundation here for the training. So first, I just want to talk a little bit about numbers so people get an idea of what, how commonly you might come across a young person who's been in foster care. So there are about 17,000 children and youth entering foster care in California each year. We are the state with the largest foster care population in the nation. Currently in California, there are a little over 42,000 children and youth in the foster care system from infancy through age 20. The upper age limit of foster care in California is age 21. So, that is something I'll say relatively new, happened in the last, 15 years. That foster care, the age of foster care was extended from 18 to 21. So now when youth turn 21, they leave care. They don't have to remain in care when they turn 18. It's an option. Most do because they're continuing to receive some financial support, help with housing, and other types of assistance. Children and youth enter foster care after experiencing abuse or neglect in their homes. And any young person, despite the nature of the abuse or neglect they received or they experienced, there is trauma. So even if, that trauma is simply from being removed from their home, that is a traumatic event. And so young people that have experienced foster care have all experienced a considerable history of trauma. And that impacts people on a range of levels throughout their life. And we're going to talk a little bit about the impact of trauma and the impact of being in foster care. So trauma has both short and long-term impacts. And even if you've had a more favorable experience in foster care and had stable placements and caring adults in your life, just simply being removed from your home is traumatic. So we're looking at a baseline of young people who are in every realm of life. You think about education, trauma does impact education significantly. We also see a lot of moves in foster care. Young people are often moving placements, and that sometimes means they move schools. Even though there are some laws to protect against that, it does happen. And so you do see lower rates of educational attainment. Young people also have higher rates of learning disabilities and other challenges with learning. And so all of that can really impact education. You see higher rates of behavioral health challenges that are stemming from experiencing trauma and not being in your home of origin, and a whole host of reasons. The impact of trauma on the brain's cognitive functioning, the ability to form healthy attachment and relationships. So all of these things are, happening as young people are developing into, from childhood to adolescence to young adulthood, and it does have a profound effect on them. So higher rates of behavioral health challenges, and then higher risk of homelessness. So you're going to be seeing young adults, right? You're not going to be assisting 5-year-olds. So you're seeing young adults. They may have already left the foster care system, despite California having a very robust source of supports compared to many other states. A lot of young people are not able to access those supports, or even after accessing those supports, are still sometimes experiencing homelessness. And then on the flip side, on the positive side, young people are so resilient, right? So despite experiencing a lot of hardship, young people rebound, and they push through and often beat the odds, right? So we're looking at young people who are strong and resilient, and despite their trauma histories are accomplishing things in life in many cases. So a little bit on kind of where we are as a system or as a society. The last decade's really been a period of reform for what we call older young adults, or excuse me, older young people, or older youth in foster care, or we also call transition age youth, right? Youth who are 18-ish or 16-ish to 24, 25-ish, right? Kind of that time period. And we've seen since foster care was extended to age 21, there's been a lot of policy change since then. There's been expansion of housing resources to ensure a safe transition out of foster care. There's been expansion of financial aid to make higher education within reach for foster youth financially. And then many other policies, but creation of the foster youth tax credit to increase income, and again, to incentivize filing. This is just scratching the surface. This is, 3 areas. There are lots of areas where we've seen reform of our laws, reform of even just the attitude toward how we handle the foster care system and the culture that we sort of operate in terms of our work with young people as a system or as a field. And so there's been a lot of changes, but I would say these are some changes to highlight. And then lastly, young adulthood looks very different for youth leaving foster care. You have to remember, I think it's easy to forget the critical importance of a family when you're a young adult. You may not be living with that family anymore, or you may be living with that family. But even if you're not living with them, there is a significant amount of support, whether it's emotional, financial, guidance, that's occurring. And many of you who may have young adult children may be very familiar with this. Or even teenagers, as a parent, how much goes into that role. And so foster youth are facing young adulthood often without the financial or emotional support of an extended family. So even if it's, not a parent, having some supportive adult in your family makes a huge difference. And not everyone has that. And when you're coming from the foster care system, you're more likely than someone from the general population to lack those permanent supports and those family supports. So what does young adulthood look like for young people leaving foster care? At 21 years old, some of the data shows 32% of former foster youth are custodial parents. So we're looking at, nearly a third of young people after they leave foster care parenting, which we all know is a life-changing event, a life-changing experience, and it changes the responsibilities that you have and the way that you have to live your life. So about a third of young people are custodial parents. 45% of former foster youth are enrolled in post-secondary education. So when you're doing people's taxes, think about those education credits and asking about those. And then annual income is very low because these are young adults, right? Young adults inherently usually have pretty low incomes. And we're looking at $10,804 as the average annual income for young people at age 21. But again, this is the annual income without having a permanent home to go to often, right? So this is them trying to make it independently. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about making foster youth or current and former foster youth feel at ease when filing taxes. So I know that many of you are, are VITA volunteers, and you're working with various populations, various age groups. You're coming across probably a lot of interesting people you're meeting, and everyone has different needs and different experiences. You probably have worked with first-time filers before. When we're talking about people who are 18, 19, 20, in their early 20s, not only are they first-time filers, but there's a lot of things just about taxes and about life that maybe that has not come across, their desk yet, right? So these are things we can't take for granted. And then also we are, we're there with the knowledge that this young person is from foster care. People may be curious. People may want to know about why they were in foster care, but that's not an appropriate question to ask. So the first thing is to remember to not ask questions that you wouldn't ask the average person, right? We don't pry into people's business beyond what you need to know to file their taxes. Now, you need to know information about their foster care experience in terms of, were they in foster care at a certain time? And we'll talk about that later, having to do with eligibility, but we don't need to know why they were in foster care. We don't need to know personal information unless they're, offering to share this with you. It's really not something that will generally be discussed, right? And then, as with anyone, you want to listen attentively. And you also, a really good practice just generally with people is to reflect with them on what you heard, so that you can see, so that they can see you want to understand, and so you can make sure you got it right? So this is what I heard you say. Is that correct? And that's a universal practice, of course, for listening. And then you really want to deploy the strategies you use to help first-time filers, right? So explaining terms, not using jargon, not using acronyms. When we're 20 years old, I know I didn't know anything about filing taxes. I wouldn't have known what any of the credits were. I wouldn't have known what it meant to have dependents. I wouldn't have known what any of the forms were. You can't assume people know anything, right, when they're a first-time filer. And then this is really important because it does happen a lot. If young people don't have all of their documents, it's really helpful to walk them through what they'll need for when they return to an appointment with you. Consider writing down what those documents are that are missing. And then we also have a tax prep checklist that could be helpful for this purpose, specifically for current and former foster youth. That link on the screen goes to, it's a forever link, so we'll update that every year and it'll be at that link. But I have to say, it is not yet updated for 2025. We just learned of the new credit amounts this week and are updating our materials to reflect those new credit amounts. And so within a week, this will be updated and it'll be at that link. And then when young people, if they get through, filing their taxes, ready for quality review, walk them over to the QR volunteer and do what we call a warm handoff, right? So that's with anything. When we're referring young people, we always try to, instead of saying, here's the information, go do it yourself, we do try to do it that first time, do it with them, make the phone call with them, walk them over to the person, introduce them. So just giving a little extra TLC can be helpful. All right, so we're going to move into section 2. This is really the section that's going to provide you a foundation for what is the foster youth tax credit. Carla will get into in just a moment into how to claim the foster youth tax credit and sort of the more hands-on like training information as a VITA volunteer, but this is really just giving you a foundation for what the foster youth tax credit is. So in 2022, we advocated for the creation of a new tax credit for current and former foster youth. And I'm really excited to say this is the first tax credit for current and former foster youth in our nation. So this is, we're cutting edge right now as a state. And I think, I have heard rumblings of other states interested in following suit and doing this, which is really exciting. So this is a state tax credit. It's the California Foster Youth Tax Credit. It was really established with the support of our former state controller, Betty Yee, Governor Gavin Newsom, and the California State Legislature, particularly Senator Ana Caballero. And the foster youth tax credit was funded at $21 million. That was sort of the estimated amount that would be necessary. It's administered by the Franchise Tax Board, of course, and they do that in partnership with the California Department of Social Services because CDSS verifies foster care eligibility for the FTB. And when combined with other credits, the foster youth tax credit, being an incentive to file, has really increased the income and reduced poverty among young people that have been in foster care. It incentivizes young people to file their taxes. Many are not required to file. I'd say probably most are not required to file because of their income level. And so this is really something new and getting them to do something that they probably wouldn't otherwise be doing. Some parenting young people were definitely filing, but a lot of young people that are not parenting are not filing at that age because they're below that income threshold. So in 2024, this is where this data comes from. The vast majority of foster youth tax credit filers received money back, only 4% owed. So 96% were in this range here. And the average return for a single filer was $1,370. The average return for a custodial parent filer, a head of household, $5,265. And you can see how much this increases annual income, the average, on average for young people in care or that were formerly in care. An 8% increase for single filers, a 57% increase for custodial filers. And that's reducing poverty, right? Which is key. And we have this data because we've partnered with a number of, like I said, organizations earlier that have become VITA sites. These are organizations serving current and former foster youth that said, sure, we'll become a VITA site. And they exclusively provide VITA services to current and former foster youth. And they have shared, we have aggregate data on all of these sites. And these are hundreds of young people. So this is a nice sample of the young people that received the FYTC last year. And just to give, because we know you're all familiar with the Cali ITC and the Young Child Tax Credit, this is just a comparison on sort of size, right? So right now where we are with the foster youth tax credit in this past tax season was 5,693 claimants, 6.1 million claimed. And you can kind of see where that lines up next to the Young Child Tax Credit and the California Earned Income Tax Credit. It's a much smaller credit. I shouldn't say smaller credit, it's a much smaller population, right? And we're right now at about 16% of the eligible population is claiming this tax credit. So we have a ways to go, but it's still, this is a very niche population, a very small population. So you're not going to come across foster youth every day at the VITA site. This is going to be a more rare occurrence. But of course, when you do, it's so important that they can get all of the credits they're eligible for. So in 2025, the foster youth tax credit will provide up to $1,154 for youth who file their state tax return, of course. And here are the eligibility, parameters that you'll need to know. Age 18 to 25 at the end of the tax year. So for next tax season, that means they would have had to be at least age 18 and no older than 25. So have not yet turned 26 on December 31st, 2024. They have to have been in foster care on or after their 13th birthday. And I'll unpack that a little bit on the next slide, I believe it is. And then eligible for the Cali ITC, which you all are familiar with what that means. So what does in foster care on or after your 13th birthday mean? So this means that a youth must have been in foster care at any time, even for a day, either during their 13th year or at any time after that age up until they turn 21. So if they entered care at 5 years old, left care at 8 years old, and did never re-enter, they wouldn't be eligible, right? If they entered care at 5 years old, left at age 14 or at age 13, they would be eligible. If they entered care at age 15, they would be eligible, right? So they had to have been in care sometime at age 13 or older. Now, what does in foster care really mean? It means the court opened up a dependency case and made an order for out-of-home placement. And one key thing to know is that there is a small population of young people who are sometimes they're called probation youth, or young people who have had experience in the juvenile probation system, who once they come out of juvenile hall, for example, the court orders them to an out-of-home placement. Those young people are legally considered foster youth, even though they don't have an open dependency case. So the key is a court order for out-of-home placement, whether they're supervised by the probation department or supervised by the child welfare agency. There's a much smaller population on the probation side, so it's way less common, but it is something to know because you may see a young person in this scenario. And just another reminder, because oh, and someone messaged that includes group homes, etc. Yes, so there is a range of foster care placements. As long as you have an order for out-of-home placement, doesn't matter what placement you're in, you're considered in foster care. Some people are placed with relatives. So they say, oh, well, I lived with my grandma. I wasn't in foster care, but their grandma was actually a relative caregiver through the foster care system. So the key is an out-of-home, an order for out-of-home placement. And we'll talk about this a little later, but there is a verification letter that the county provides or the state provides that will state whether that's the case. They don't have to have that letter, but that is sort of their backup verification if the verification that happens with the FTB and CDSS fails. Carla will get into those weeds later. And someone, I think, asked again about the recording. Yes, we are recording this, and we will send this out. So next, we're going to jump into some scenarios just to talk about, because eligibility is such a key part of this and understanding it. We're going to do a quick little poll or quiz. So I'm seeing somehow this person has two names. It's Tanya at the top, Sarah at the bottom. That's okay. We'll roll with it because this actually commonly happens. Young people in foster care often change their names, which Carla will also talk about later because that is significant to know for tax filing. So this is a great little mistake to have made. So Tanya, or Sarah, is 20 years old. She entered foster care when she was 8 years old. She was placed in a relative foster care placement with her aunt and remained there until age 18. At that time, she chose to move into a foster care placement for young adults called the Supervised Independent Living Placement. She worked in a cafe in 2023. So again, Sarah's 20. She entered foster care at age 8. She was placed in a relative foster care placement and was there until 18. So I'm going to launch this poll and let's have some fun. Let's enter what we think the answer is, and then we'll see how many people got it right. All right, I'm going to end the poll, share the results. Correct answer is yes. So almost everyone, I got this one right. Good job. I'm going to move on to our next scenario. We have 3 of these. All right. So our next scenario is about Robert. So Robert's 23. He was in foster care at age 10. And then at age 12, he was reunified with his mother. So he exited foster care to reunification. He later became homeless, but he never re-entered foster care. He earned income in 2023 working in an auto body shop. Is he eligible for the foster youth tax credit? So I'm going to, trying to get this poll up here. All right. All right. Give people just another couple seconds. Okay. So the correct answer here is no. So he is not eligible because he exited foster care at age 12. He was reunified with his mother. So that's the most common way to exit foster care, is to reunify. And that's the goal. That's the hope, that every young person is able to reunify with their family, and that their family is able to get into a situation or a place where they are able to provide a safe home, safe and healthy home for their child. If that is not possible, the goal would be guardianship or adoption. And then if that is not possible, young people end up remaining in foster care. So that could be a whole other webinar. We could talk about, goals and exits and what that looks like, and the federal and the state laws on that, but that's not what we're talking about today. But I will just say, most people who exit, they do reunify. And sometimes young people do end up back in the foster care system. Sometimes they do not. The hope is that they don't need to be. The hope is that things are going great at home. We know that that is not always the case, right? So sometimes people re-enter. In this situation, this is a good example to talk about, because Robert became homeless. He maybe could have re-entered the foster care system if that had come to the attention of authorities, that he did not have a safe place to live, but it apparently did not. And so he never re-entered foster care. So he exited at 12, which is before that 13th year, that cutoff. So despite him having earned income, and despite him having been in foster care at some point in his life, he's not eligible because he doesn't meet those eligibility parameters. So that is unfortunate for Robert in terms of getting the tax credit, but it is that is the eligibility. Okay, so next we'll talk about Leticia. Leticia is 21 years old. She entered foster care at age 11 and remained in foster care until age 16, when she exited foster care into a legal guardianship with her aunt. Her aunt continued to be her legal guardian until age 18. Leticia is now attending San Jose State University and works part-time in the bookstore. Is she eligible for the foster youth tax credit? So again, she remained in care. She entered at 11, remained in care until age 16. I'm going to launch this poll. This is our last one. And then we'll move on. All right. So the correct answer is yes. So she was in care on or after age 13, because she entered at 11 and she was in care until age 16. So that's after age 13. She went into a legal guardianship, and so she's eligible. She worked as well. Okay. So moving along, I'm going to now pass this over to Carla. Here's the real core training part of the training, where you get to look and see what this looks like in TaxSlayer and where to do what. And so I'll pass it to Carla now.
Hello, everyone. Hello, fellow VITA volunteers. As Simone stated earlier, this will now be my 4th year being a VITA volunteer, but specifically for foster youth. And there's a question, so I will be touching up on legal guardianship in a moment. So now for this section, we are going to review screen by screen description on how to claim the foster youth tax credit, the consent to data matching with the California Department of Social Services, the tax filer's name used while in care, and then the option to upload the documentation related to their foster care status. Next slide, please. So here we see where the foster youth tax credit is in TaxSlayer. So it is in the the California state-specific credits at the very end. So a lot of times this is missed, unfortunately, because it is at the bottom. Next slide. So once you hit begin, then it takes you to this section in TaxSlayer. So it is on the top of the screen, and then you would hit continue on this screen. And next slide. So here's the meat of the foster youth tax credit. So when you first get to this screen in tax layer, you will see on the top what the description is for eligibility of the tax credit. So again, as Simone stated earlier, foster youth had to be a dependent of the court on or after their 13th, after their age of 13, and in out-of-home care. So that again, meaning they are not living with their parent. And the foster youth is a non-minor dependent, an NMD. This is a program for youth in foster care ages 18 to 21. As mentioned earlier, youth in California can stay in care up until 21. So foster youth in this program will typically say, when they turn 21, you may hear them say, oh, I aged out or I emancipated at 21. So you may hear that terminology from them. And then also foster youth who did age out and are the ages between 21 and 25, they are also eligible for this credit. So it's important to, read this foster youth tax credit eligibility to the young person to ensure that they meet these qualifications. So for those youth whose cases closed prior to 18, they may have returned home, just like one of our scenarios, and or a legal guardianship or adoption was established. In these two cases, you may need to take a minute and ask them, is there anyone else who can claim them on their tax credit? So it's really important to just really be patient with them, ask those specific questions. Can anyone else claim you? So either way, you can check both of these boxes that yes, the taxpayer is eligible for the credit, and yes, they are consenting that the California Department of Social Services is able to share information with the California Franchise Tax Board to ensure their eligibility. Next slide. So this is a really important piece. As stated earlier, in that scenario, young people tend to change their names just because it may be, they like to change their name from Brandy with an I to a Y or something like that after they left foster care. So sometimes youth do change their names, and it is done legally through the foster care system. Their names have to match letter to letter as it was when they are in foster care. So you want to ask them, is it the exact same spelling of their name? Explain to them it has to be letter to letter. If a young person aged out of foster care and they got married, they have to use the name that they had in foster care. So not their married name. They have to use, you may want to say, you may want to ask what was your government name while you were in foster care? Because either way, if it's not spelled the right way, that can affect them receiving the foster youth tax credit. Next slide. And then this is the section where they can upload their dependency letter. That's what the letter, that is the name that a lot of young people use and a lot of social workers and case managers use to verify the foster youth eligibility for certain other programs as well. So it's called a dependency letter. So they do have the option to upload it here. However, we are instructing and encouraging our young people to self-disclose during the intake process. So when they first, come into the VITA site and they're doing that intake paperwork, this is where we are telling our young people to self-disclose that they are a current or former foster youth. And also, if you are working with a young person 18 to 25, again, you may want to go back to like that section, the slide 23, and just make sure that they do meet those eligibility requirements. If they do have a letter, it needs to be on a county issued letterhead. So, and include the dates that they entered and exited foster care. And again, note that this is a California credit. So if there's a young person that their case originated outside of California, but they may be placed here in California, they are not eligible to receive this credit. We do have some youth that are placed outside of California, and they may be eligible if they lived in California for 6 months of that, 6 months or more of that tax year. So, I've helped young people from other states receive this credit, and some received the full amount and some received only a portion of it. Next slide.
Carla, just one thing I want to interject, because we did hear about this coming up last tax season where some VITA sites said we can't we can't claim this credit on your behalf without this letter. That is not the case. So we just want to make clear, this is recommended because best case scenario, the young person has their letter. If they have their letter, absolutely upload it. But if they don't have it, don't turn them away. The idea is that CDSS and FTB verify status without that letter, and it all goes swimmingly. Should that fail, the letter provides a backup, okay? And if there isn't a backup, the young person will get a letter in the mail saying you need to verify your eligibility. So worst case scenario, they get that letter, but best case scenario, they're uploading a letter up front. But again, if you don't have a letter, you don't have to upload it, because there is a back-end verification going on. So sorry to just underscore that, but that is something we heard come up this past tax season.
Thank you, Simone. Okay, next slide. All right, so in this section, we are going to cover how to treat foster care payments when filing taxes, issues of other individuals claiming a foster on their taxes, other credits that youth could be eligible for on the state and federal side, amendments, and then prior tax years. Next slide. So as a VITA volunteer, you'll be helping youth who are current and former foster youth filing their taxes. And many foster youth receive payments for housing. In most cases, the youth will receive these payments directly. It is important to note that these foster care payments are not taxable payments and they are not earned income. So therefore, they should not be included in their tax return. Next slide. So the two most common placements for a foster youth while they are in care is first the supervised independent living placement. This is for NMDs, that group of youth ages 18 to 21. So you may hear a young person say, I was in a SILP placement. And youth placed in this placement, they receive the payment directly. In 2024, this placement was $1,258. The second placement is additional housing placement for non-minor dependents. It's called THP NMD. And in this situation, the foster youth receive a stipend from their housing provider. And the stipends may vary from program to program and county to county. So with both of these housing types, the funding the foster youth receive again is not considered taxable income and should not be counted. Next slide. For youth who age out of foster care at 21, typically many of them are participating in another housing program called THP Plus. Youth who participate in this program receive a stipend for their rent, utilities, transportation, and food. Again, it's not earned income, so it should not be included in their tax return. And unfortunately, some of these housing programs issue a 1099 to these young people. That's not what 1099s were intended to do, and it's quite unfortunate for these foster youth, but they still must be claimed in their taxes. And JBay is educating housing providers about that practice, and there are a handful of them that do it. And so hopefully with some education, hopefully they'll stop issuing those 1099s. In addition to the housing programs, let's go back to youth that are in care. So many of them participate in a case management program called the Independent Living Program. And some youth who participate in this program may receive a payment for attending a workshop or class. This is not taxable income, so they cannot use it to claim the foster youth tax credit because it's not earned. Next slide. So a second topic related to filing taxes for foster youth is whether another adult has filed their taxes, included them as a dependent. As noted earlier in the training, there's a high level of mobility among youth in foster care. Given that, there is sometimes ambiguity as to whether another household can claim them on their taxes. When working with current and former foster youth, please take a moment to ask them if another individual can claim them on their taxes. As a fellow VITA volunteer, I educate foster youth and I explain to them if they lived with someone for more than 6 months and that person provided more than half of their care, that that person can actually claim them on their taxes. If a youth is unsure, then you may take a moment and ask them like, hey, can you call your social worker or probation officer or even their caregiver to clarify? In the past, just a little terminology here, in the past, a relative caregiver or community approved to care for children and youth in foster care was called a foster home. That was, the name that everyone used was a foster home. Now they are called a resource home. So you may hear a young person refer to that type of placement. I was in a resource family home with my aunt, my grandmother. So you may hear that. Slide. Next slide. So let's look at the qualifying child or relative. So unfortunately, we do have some situations that a child, a current or former foster youth, is falsely claimed on a tax return. So the two most common scenarios are a former foster parent or resource parent continues claiming a foster youth after they moved out, or they exited foster care to reunify with a parent and or guardianship or adoption was established, but that arrangement fell apart and the youth no longer lives with that caregiver. The key information in these two scenarios is whether they lived and were provided with more than half of their support by this person during that tax year. If not, that person should not be claiming them as a dependent. And if yes, the table here provides more information about whether they should or should not be claimed by that individual. As I noted earlier, if the youth is unsure, in most cases, they can call their previous resource family and ask, are they claiming them on their taxes or not? If the young person is uncomfortable because sometimes the placements don't end well, then that situation may lead to the youth asking their social worker or probation officer for assistance in obtaining that information. And therefore, they may not get that information right away. So the youth may have to come back to finalize their return. So just be aware of that type of a situation. And for us, so excuse me, so some of the foster specific VITA sites that JBA has worked with, sometimes those sites just went ahead and did a paper return. If that, if you do the return with the young person and it was rejected, but the foster youth says like, hey, no, they can't claim me. I was only living with them for 2 to 3 months. Sometimes those VITA sites went ahead and sent in a paper return and they just, will let the IRS, Franchise Tax Board, investigate all of that. And in those situations, we always explain to the young person that you may receive a letter from either of those agencies, the IRS or the FTB, asking for more information. So if a young person, if this is the case, then you clearly explain to the young person, you'll probably receive a letter asking for more documentation. And you have to respond within that given timeline. Anyone receiving a letter from the IRS, FTB, they can get a little worried, scared about that. But just, tell the young person, you're probably going to get a letter, get the documentation needed and respond in that timeline that's given. If the young person may need support, they can ask their probation officer, social worker, a housing case manager, an adult supporter that they trust to help them to, decipher what is being asked. And we wanted to share some foster care terminology that you may hear when working with a foster youth. So again, a guardianship, that is when a child or youth is placed under the legal authority of another adult until the age of 18. And this could be a guardianship with a relative. It could be, with someone that the young person is very close with. So it doesn't necessarily have to be with a relative. It could be a very close family friend, and the court, places that young person in a guardianship type of situation. Adoption, that is when the parents' rights are terminated through the court and the child or youth is adopted by another adult. And again, this could be an adoption through a relative and or a very close family friend, or a relative, or a community home that was approved by the child welfare department, and the young person is adopted by those parents. So it doesn't technically have to be someone related. Next slide. So let's just cover some of the other credits that young people in foster care can receive. So here, the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Independent Care Credit, the Federal Child Tax Credit, and the American Opportunity or Lifetime Learning Credit. Next slide. On the California side, we have, again, the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Young Child Tax Credit, the Child Independent Care Expenses Credit, and then we have the Renter's Credit. And I want to note here that we do have some parenting foster youth, and it's important to educate them as to who can claim them as a dependent. So if the parents are together and filing jointly, as we know, the child is treated as the qualifying child of the parents. If the parents are filing separately, then we want to look at, again, like, who did that child live with for that, for 6 months or more of that tax year, and who provided most of their care. And that, that other parent may be involved in that child's life or not involved. So it's important to educate, a parenting foster youth of, like, who can claim their child or children as a dependent on their taxes. So, you just want, just as we talked about before, who can claim the foster youth on their tax return. Now we're here in the same situation, but with a parenting foster youth and their child. So again, you just want to educate them with that. But we do have some foster youth who they do have children, but they are not able to claim because their child is actually a dependent of foster care. So unfortunately, that does occur. As Simone touched on earlier, a lot of these young people experience a lot of trauma. And when they become parents, they have not had, good role modeling in parenting. So their child may be removed from them. So it is important to, ask those questions. If they are parenting foster youth, is their child in their care? Did they have their child with them for more than 6 months and they provided for more than support? So you want to definitely have those conversations with them. Next slide. So foster youth commonly require an amendment to their taxes. In 2024, this occurred when a young person either paid to have their taxes filed by a paid preparer, or they self-filed and missed the foster youth tax credit on the state return. As we saw earlier, it's at the bottom of the state credits. So sometimes young people did not scroll down or did not see it, and they missed out on it. So take the time to ask a young person, did they file last year and did they receive the credit? You may need to instruct them where to find it on the state return. And if they didn't receive it, then let them know they can get an amendment for that tax season, and explain to them what documents are needed. They need that copy of that tax return. And I always ask them to also bring in, whatever tax documents they had, because that can also be helpful. Next slide. So a final important topic to note is asking current and former foster youth whether they have filed previous tax years. In 2023, a full 40% of tax filings completed at one of the JBA's 7 VITA sites was for a prior tax return year. So collectively, these 2 prior tax years provided an extra 685,000 to 299 youth. So that's a significant amount of money. This is an average of 2,293 additional refunds. This level of funding is significant, and therefore it's important to emphasize to youth and their adult supporters, their social workers, POs, caregivers, case managers, and community partners, the importance of foster youth filing for past tax years. And now I'll return it to Simone.
Thanks, Carla. All right. So this is our 5th and final section. And it'll cover how to ensure young people receive their refund. It'll include confirming that the youth has a safe place to receive their refund. It'll cover identity theft and tax fraud. We know that's slightly more common among young people who have been in foster care, unfortunately. And how to set up a payment plan if they have tax liability, which is more rare. And then informing the young person how to check the status of their refund. And some of these things you all are already familiar with because they're things you do with other clients. But we'll talk about them a little bit more specific to foster youth. So, sorry, I just got to move this. My screen's blocked here. Here we go. So first, it's important to confirm that the young person has a safe place to receive their tax refund if it's a check. Many young people who will be filing don't necessarily have stable housing, or where they're maybe not going to be there for a long period of time, or a consistent mailing address to have a paper check mailed to them. That's definitely a common scenario. And for that reason, it's important to inform them that they should provide an address where mail can be received securely and for, some period of time, not just for the next week, but for, months to come. So sometimes that doesn't mean where they're living at that moment. It has to be somewhere where they know, a person they can trust lives there, and that they'll be able to receive mail there. Another thing to raise here is that some young people may not have a bank account for direct deposit. So there's definitely a goal within the foster care system that every young person has a bank account before they leave care, but that doesn't mean that 100% of young people have reached that goal. So that's really important to know. And really or actually, sorry, this is on the next slide. So I'll stop here and we'll go to the next slide. I was going to start talking about identity protection pins. So some youth will require help with their identity protection pin. Carla mentioned earlier that young people that have been in foster care have a high rate of identity theft. They've been in a lot of different foster care placements, and unfortunately, that in some cases has resulted in, years later, someone whose care they've been in has, in some cases, maybe erroneously claimed them, like Carla talked about, but in some cases, even used their social security number. And, that's not a common experience. It's more common that you have foster parents that are not doing that than are doing that, but it does come up, unfortunately. And so if, for example, a previous caregiver may, if they've used someone's social security number to try to file a fraudulent tax return, that's going to affect the young person when they try to file their taxes, right? So, if you're working with the young person from foster care and this comes up, you've got to talk the young person through completing the form 14039 identity theft affidavit. And also explain that it'll take time for the IRS to process this. And so receiving their return will sometimes take a little more time. So really helpful to sort of walk them through what this means, establish the identity protection PIN, and in some cases, young people might have filed last year and may not know their identity protection PIN. And so if they lose it, also maybe helping them relocate it using the URL on the screen. And I know everyone's probably familiar with this process because this is a general process that VITA volunteers know about, but just kind of being aware that this is something that may arise more frequently with young people who have been in foster care. And then, like we said earlier, it is more rare that young people in foster care or have been in foster care owe money. But, and for example, earlier this year, the past tax season, just 4% of young people who filed as part of the Foster Youth Tax Project, had a tax liability. On average, they owed $966. But a lot of times these young people are going to maybe require a payment plan, right? So helping them develop that payment plan with the IRS is also really, really helpful. And then checking the status of the refund, right? That's something we often get calls at JBay and they're like, how do I check my return? I filed with the site you referred me to. How do I check it? So that's a really common question. It's really helpful when you finish with them if you can remind them, this is how to check your refund. And then also just, again, these are young people who are often filing for the first time. And if they're filing not for the first time, it's one of the first, they only been filing for a year or two. So it's really helpful to remind them common practices like keeping their tax return in a safe place, remembering to keep it for the next year, and remembering to keep 5 years of tax returns, is a good rule of thumb. So these are really helpful tips that you can give someone. And then lastly, I just want to share, we scratched the surface here on this issue and really tried to stick with what we thought was need to know information so that we didn't have a 5-hour training, right? But if you want to learn more about the foster youth tax credit and sort of what implementation has looked like in the first few years, you can refer to this report. We've put it out each year since the credit became available. So this year, a couple months ago, and then also in 2023. And it has a bunch of information about how many youth have filed, how much they've received, findings, recommendations, a whole bunch of information in there. And then before we go on to questions, we just want to do a quick second quiz here, poll, same exact question. Where are you on a scale from 0 to 10? How familiar are you now with assisting foster youth clients and claiming the foster youth tax credit? Now that you've received this information, I know sometimes it takes a little bit to sink in. You may have questions that we're going to go into in a second, but we really want to know where you are, an hour and 15 minutes later, an hour later, given this information. So 0 being, I don't feel prepared yet. 10 being, I have the information I need to feel prepared. So I'm going to launch this poll one last time, and then we'll go into questions. Great. I'm glad I don't see any 0s or 1s yet, but if there are 0s or 1s, that's okay. All right. Great. I'm going to end the poll here. So we're looking pretty good. We're looking better than we started, right? It's a nice sizable, about a third of people are at 8, which is great. So we'll go into questions now. And if you want to contact us at a later date, our emails are on the screen, but let's jump in here. So I'm going to go, I know we've been answering some questions in the chat and in the questions box. Again, yes, you will receive these slides and this recording later today. And like I said, a little 3-question survey. We want to know how to improve this training. This was our first pass at it. And so it's really helpful to know what information was too much, what was too little. Are there areas that we didn't cover that would be helpful? So first, let's talk about this. Carla, I have a question for you. So 1099s, if a 1099 is issued for a foster care payment, even if we know that that's not correct and that's not the intention of a 1099, do they have to include it? And I know you answered this in the questions, but if you can answer for everyone.
Yes, they do have to include the 1099, and especially as a VITA volunteer. So if a young person brings you that copy of a 1099, you now know of that document. And so you definitely do have to include that as the tax return in their tax return. So yes.
Thank you. And I'll just underscore again, there's majority of programs are not doing this. So that will not be the common experience. And we are trying to get to all of these programs that are doing this and reassure them that that they don't, they're doing it because they believe, they'll say, my auditor said we had to do this, or right. They believe that they have to. So it's not because they want to screw young people over. Certainly it is erring on the side of, of concern about doing things correctly. And so we are doing our best to educate them, and we'll continue to do that. Veronica, thank you for chatting this into the questions box. This is in reference to Carla's earlier covering the when FTB sends you a letter and says, respond to this notice, and you have a time limit. Veronica said, look, if they miss the deadline to respond to a notice, they can still respond. Don't give up. And so just underscoring that, making sure that everyone sees that comment. We want to underscore that don't give up message. All right. So another question we got was about, and again, this is one of those more complex questions, and I don't think everyone has to know the ins and outs of foster care placement to assist a young person with their taxes, but I know that these questions are often helpful to understand. Someone asks, is legal guardianship the same thing as being in foster care with a relative? It is not. There's some overlap there. It could be, but it's generally not. It's not the same thing. And so I'll just explain this. But again, the key is, did they have an order for out-of-home placement, right? A court order. And if you aren't sure, and if the young person isn't sure, if they're like, well, I live with my grandma, I don't know if it was foster care or if it was guardianship, I'm not really sure, I was young, I can't remember. We'll usually ask questions like, did you see a social worker every month? Did you have an attorney? There are things you can ask, but I would say as a VITA volunteer and you got your time, you can't spend 5 hours with someone, the best thing to do is err on the side of generosity, right? So claim it. If they are not eligible, the worst thing that'll happen is FTB will send a letter saying, we couldn't verify this. They can then go to their county and say, can you give me a verification dependency letter? And the county will say, here it is, or actually you weren't in foster care. So it's okay if they don't know and you're not clear to claim it, if there's a chance that they might be eligible. But I'll say the difference between being in a relative foster care placement and in guardianship with a relative is really semantics, right? From the viewpoint of a young person, they're living with grandma. It kind of doesn't matter to them, right? The key is when you are in a foster care placement with grandma, she is being, you have an open dependency case and she is your foster care caregiver. And frankly, there is more oversight. There's a social worker visiting you every month. You have an attorney representing you, and it is a foster care placement. If you go into dependency and your dependency is if you go into guardianship and your dependency case is terminated, you are now, that person is your guardian. You are not getting a social worker visit every month. You are not in foster care anymore. There are cases, and I was chatting with someone in the chat about this, where they'll put you in guardianship and they'll leave your dependency case open, and that's called a guardianship with dependency. And what that means is they want to do some more monitoring. They want you to go into this guardianship and continue to sort of monitor how you're doing in this guardianship. That is more rare than going into a straight up guardianship. So again, you don't have to know all these ins and outs to assist someone as a VITA volunteer, but we're also happy to, if you want to know more, email us and we're happy to talk more about the ins and outs of different foster care placements. All right. The next question is, and I'll send this one to you, Carla, if a child was in foster care at age 13, but is no longer in foster care as a young adult, right? So they were in foster care, let's say they exited at age 17. They're eligible for the tax credit. Do they continue to be eligible every year until they turn 26? Or are they just eligible for some temporary period of time?
Well, if they aged out at 17, again, there's that question, who are they living with? Was that person able to claim them on their taxes? So because they're still a minor, you know, can someone claim them? And so if they're after, let's say, at 18, they're on their own. Again, you go back to age 13, they were in foster care. They should go ahead, check those boxes, and let the California Department of Social Services and Franchise Tax Board, determine their eligibility. So yes, but if they are 17, we want to check, ask those questions. Who are they living with? Did that person, can that person claim them? If not, then let's, after the age of 18, let's go ahead and, check those boxes, if that makes sense.
So yes, so the answer is
Yeah.
yes, they're eligible unless someone else is claiming them,
Yep.
which would be the case for anyone. But if they're not being claimed by someone, yes, they're eligible each year until they turn 26. So it's not, and it's not a situation where like if they're in care at 18 and then they leave at, say they leave at 19, they stop being eligible. If you've been deemed eligible because you were in care on after 13, you're eligible each year. You can claim it until you can no longer claim it because you get too old. But again, for anyone, the claiming issue, the being claimed with someone else's tax return could be an issue. But often young people are no longer being supported by former caregivers. So that is often the case. All right. So is it safe to say that if the foster youth does not have a letter or are not sure initially if they recall the specifics, such as dates, age, etc., that the FTB can deny the credit on their end if the info is not verified? Absolutely. So I think I said this earlier, but if there's uncertainty on behalf of the young person or you as a VITA volunteer, err on the side of generosity, claim the credit. FTB can always reject it, right? If they end up not being eligible. All right. So scrolling down to additional questions. Okay, so this is an important one because maybe this seems like maybe something we need to spend a little more time on as I'm thinking back. It seems like the foster youth tax credit had to have earned income. Is that correct? Yes. So you have to be eligible for the Cali ITC to claim the foster youth tax credit. And as you all know, part of eligibility for the Cali ITC is having at least $1 of earned income. All right.
Also, there was a comment. So there's legal guardianship, and another term you may hear is a kin gap case. And that form of guardianship that foster youth can be placed under. And so again, they're the same thing. It's a guardianship, but kin gap terminology was that it was a kin member who the guardianship was established with. But now I believe in the foster care system, it's the same. It's just a legal guardianship. So that's just another terminology that you may hear from a young person. And they may not, again, if they were in that guardianship, we go back to those questions. Is that person able to, claim you on their taxes? So that's the question you want to ask the young person.
Okay, here's a really good one. This could be a good thing for us to add to this training. Someone asked for an example of language for sort of screening for their VITA site for identifying eligibility for the foster youth tax credit. So I would say there are two important things to ask. One would be their age, right? And so if they're not any older than 25 on the last day of the tax year. So it would be a question about that, about age. And the second one would be, were you in foster care on or after your 13th birthday? So are you under the age of 26, or were you under the age of 26 on December 31st, in this case, 2024? And were you in foster care on or after your 13th birthday? So those would be two really good questions to add. And then the rest of it is really about, Cali ITC eligibility. So if there's some way to say something like, because I don't know if you're screening for Cali ITC eligibility, but that's the other piece of it to add in, which I imagine you're already probably doing. Those two questions I mentioned would be good. There's of course little like, were you in foster care in California? There's some nuanced things, but that's, it's not as common that you're going to come across young people in California that weren't in care in California. It comes up, but it's definitely not the common experience. So I'd say for screening, you could probably live with those two questions. Carla, what do you think? Any other questions you think would be key for as a screening question for eligibility?
I think those are good questions to ask. Yeah.
Great. And someone mentioned, I work for SSA and our VITA sites do offer customers an opportunity to open checking savings accounts on site with US Bank through a community financial resources. That's great. Fantastic. I hope everyone's doing that. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And sometimes some young people, they may have had savings or, account and they, overdrew money and stuff. So they may have some issues with that, but it's great that that resource is there and available to them because again, not all of them have that to, checking or savings account to have their refund sent to them quickly. Because a lot of our young people, they want that money quick. So, and some chats about the IPIN. Yes. So make sure that the young person, if you're helping them create the IPIN, inform them that the IRS will send that IPIN to the address on their tax return. So if hopefully that's a solid address for them to send that letter. And again, they can, have them create the IPIN, have them go into the ID.me, check status, so just educate them on that specific item there, the IPIN, and where that letter gets sent. Let's see, what else do we have?
Here's a good one. How far back can they amend previous tax returns? When did the foster youth tax credit start? Carly, you want to take this one?
Oh my gosh, I always get confused with this date, Simone.
So
Yeah.
tax credit was established in 2022, but first became available in the 2023 tax season.
Yes.
So for tax year 2022.
Yeah.
So they can amend, they can file their 2022 tax return and the 2023 tax return when they file with you this year. And we absolutely encourage that. So if you're filing with a young person this year, ask them if they filed last year, ask them if they filed the year before. Now, again, depending on their age, like if they're young, they may not have yet been eligible, but as long as they're within the age range during those years, they should be fine. And as long as they were, had earned income, as long as they meet all the eligibility parameters for those years, definitely file those previous tax years. I'm not sure, Elaine, if you want to send a follow-up, it says, does foster parents need to file payment too? I'm not sure what that's in reference to, but if you want to send a follow-up with more information, we're happy to answer that question. Oh, and Veronica, thank you. It says, let them know it's possible that the FYTC will not be provided if they were placed with kin gap or legal guardianship. It's always good to temper expectations. That's a great suggestion. So even though you can, like we said, operate on the generosity model, claim it, and see what happens if there's lack of clarity, it's always good to not say, you're going to get this, right? Because if they're not sure and you're not sure, it's good to say, look, let's claim it because we're not totally clear on your eligibility. And you may get it and you may not. If you were in a guardianship through kin gap or other channels, like you might not be eligible, right? Because there's also, not to make this even more complex, there's also guardianships that were set up in probate court. That is completely outside the foster care system. They would not be eligible. So there's a lot, as we know, with the courts and with legal terms for all of these different arrangements, it can get very confusing and very complex. And to the young person, it doesn't sometimes look any different. They're just living in a home with someone, who's their guardian. And so they often don't, know the complexities behind it. So if you get a case where that is the situation, temper expectations, but operate on the generosity model in terms of claiming.
And there was another thing, tax layer, yes, they can go back. Tax layer limits 3 years, the past 3 years to do their tax returns. Some sites will actually do a paper return for beyond 3 years. So it depends on the site. I've talked to some sites throughout the state and they will do a 4th year back, but it will be done on a paper return.
And someone clarified, Carla, I'll let you take this one. The IPIN,
Yes.
they're saying you can't use last year's PIN. Can you just kind of share that with everyone?
Yeah, well, the IRS will send you a letter with a new IPIN. So you want, and again, when I said it's very important to, explain to the young person that the IPIN, the letter that you receive from the IRS, they will send it to the address that is on your tax return. I said earlier, hopefully it is a good solid address, but they should always look out for that. And, if they moved, let's say a young person was in a THP NMD placement, so a placement for 18 to 21-year-olds, but they moved out of that. They may want to let that agency know, hey, I may be getting a letter from the IRS. Um, so just make sure they're aware of that. And one thing that I did hear from, I just completed my tax training this past weekend for the advanced level. And one thing that I heard from the trainers was this last year, because we experienced a lot of young people who we had to create an IPIN, we had to create the ID.me and create an IPIN for them before we were able to file their taxes. And for some reason, it came up a lot during self-filing events. And what I heard from our trainer this past week was the IRS, for some reason, they had a large list of people that they required them to create these IPINs. We don't know why, but I don't know if any of you had experienced that a lot this past year, but so we had to create a lot of IPINs for these young people. So again, instructing them like do you have a solid address? This letter for next year is going to come to that address that's on your tax return. So just explaining that to them is very important.
And someone asked, would you guys consider providing sites with your flow chart provided in this training, which has the questions to ask customers? Absolutely. I want to make sure, when you say flow chart, do you just mean set the questions that we shared in response to the question about screening? If there are screening questions we suggest, or is there a specific slide? If Vera, if you wanna respond, feel free. But we will provide, again, if anyone missed it earlier, we'll provide these slides and we'll provide the recording later today. Feel free to share them with whomever you'd like. And we can also share maybe in the follow-up email the screening questions that we suggested with the wording. I think we've covered all the questions. I know there were several comments about the 1099s, but I think we talked about that. Basically, the IRS knows you've been issued a 1099, so you've got to report it. You can't toss it out, unfortunately. So I think we got it, that one. And I think we answered all the other questions. Carla, are you seeing any that I'm missing?
No, I think we answered a lot of them. I think we covered most everything. But again, too, if you have questions, you have our information. So please email us, either Simone or I, and we'll answer your questions for. And during this tax season, I will be doing taxes just with all of you probably. So yeah, just shoot us an email and we'll get back to you as soon as we can.
Thank you so much, and we'll be in touch later today with the information and the resources. Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Happy holidays, Happy New Year. Happy filing.